Good morning. Welcome to a joint meeting of the Atheist Community of San Jose and the Humanist Community of Silicon Valley. My name is Alex Havasi. I'm a member of both, and more active in the Humanist Community right now. But if you want to find out more about it, you can go to our website, www.humanist.org. You'll find out more about our organization and upcoming events, and more importantly, how to donate to the Humanist Community so you can continue to present these forums. We're fortunate to have a speaker provided by Judith Bannister, who's the treasurer of the Atheist Community. And I'll let Judith introduce the speaker.
Good morning, everyone. So I am Judith Bannister, the treasurer of the Atheist Community of San Jose. The Atheist Community is very proud and pleased to jointly work with the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley to host Dr. Elizabeth Drescher, adjunct professor at Santa Clara University in Santa Clara, California. This is a hybrid event in person and on Zoom, which we love doing whenever possible. Dr. Drescher has spoken to us before about the rise of the nones in the United States. Nones, N-O-N-E-S, meaning people who are not identified with any particular religion, according to the data from the Pew Research Center and other organizations. Dr. Drescher is an expert on non-religion in America. In fact, this is her book that she published called Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of Americans' Nones, N-O-N-E-S, nuns. This was published in 2016, so that was a while ago, but Dr. Drescher every year has had to become up to the minute in all the data on non-religion in America, because every year or almost every year, she teaches at least one quarter, sometimes 2 quarters, of a course on non-religion in America, which is very popular at Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit university, by the way. We are very pleased to host her students, both the Atheist Community and the Humanist Community and the other secular groups around the area, in order to let her students know how lively our non-religion organizations and community is in the Silicon Valley region. Dr. Drescher is a good speaker and a good teacher, and we're pleased to host her students whenever we get the opportunity. So Dr. Drescher is up to the minute, and we all need to know what the current state of non-religion in America is, and we depend on Dr. Drescher for catching us up to date. Welcome, Dr. Drescher.
So recently there's been some new data out about religious identification and affiliation that's caused conversation in both religious and non-religious communities. And basically, Pew identified in their 2024 data, which was released in early 2025, a very small increase in religious affiliation and a very small decrease in non-religious or non-religious identification or religious unaffiliation, which caused a lot of conversation about whether the rise of the nones, the so-called rise of those people who answer none when asked with what religion they identify or affiliate, which began in the 1990s, is that over? Well, the short answer is no. But that needs a little bit of nuancing. We need to think more about what might be going on with this data. And I would argue that non-religious communities and individuals need to understand and actively engage the challenges presented by shifting experiences on the religious and non-religious landscape in American life. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that today. And I'm not sure why, but I'm still getting an echo on my.
That's fine.
Okay. I'll just pretend then that I'm vaguely psychotic and hearing myself as I talk. Okay, so this is a baseline. It's largely PRI data with some nuancing from some other data sets from 2023. And so what we see is a big slice of the American population, about 27%. Pew goes up to 29%. The General Social Survey is down to 23%. PRRI tends to take the mean of that. And so we see that at about 27%, the dominant, so that makes non-religion, if it were a religion, the largest religious affiliation in the United States. So again, bigger than evangelical Protestantism, bigger than mainline Protestantism, bigger than Catholicism, and any other religious group. So quite a social phenomenon, although religious affiliation, of course, remains, and identification remains at about 70% across the country. And so here's where we've seen this shift most recently in the Pew data. Right around 2020, we see kind of 2021, the peak of religious unaffiliation at 29, 30%, depending on surveys, and then it dips down. Some people think of this as a pandemic effect, right? That people maybe got more involved in religion during the pandemics. The data doesn't support that. We know that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of churches closed during the pandemic. That doing live streaming didn't seem to help. And in fact, those communities that did more actively get involved in digital platforms tended to erode themselves away, because once people felt like I don't have to show up, then they didn't, right? But this is what all of the fuss is about among both academics in the field and largely religious communities that are thinking, okay, here's what's going on. So let's kind of look at this data a little bit more. Okay, so, and this, I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, so I'll try to walk through it. So what we've seen in the development of non-religious people around the United States is that if you'd looked 20 years ago, the majority of non-religious people were men, largely white men with college educations, making, I don't know what the relative numbers are, but middle class to upper middle class. It was a kind of elite masculinist project. And when I first started teaching the class that Judy mentioned, Non-Religion in America at Santa Clara, probably 7 or 8 years ago, the students who took that course, every quarter I was biting my nails to see if enough students were going to enroll. And it would be the kind of stereotypical 9 engineering geeks and a philosophy major that would show up for that class. Now, the majority of my students are women. The classes are always full, they're always over enrolled, and they're from a wide range of disciplines. And we've seen, so we see right now that the breakdown of the non-religious are about equally male and female, right? More white, I'll show you a slide in a minute, shows how that's shifting, distributed across the country, right? We think of The Pacific Northwest for a long time was known as the nun zone. The West Coast, the East Coast, essentially elite coastal areas were seen as rife with nuns, and that's probably true, but they're saturated. So over the last decade, the growth in religious unaffiliation has actually been in the South and the Southwest, where there's, they're just more, for a lot of reasons. People are moving there more for job opportunities and things like that. But also there's just more opportunity there for growth. So you see that, and you're seeing lots more growth in the South and in the West. Income distribution is evening out considerably among the non-religious. So no longer a middle upper class phenomenon. There are questions about why this is, and we'll get to that when we talk about the varieties of non-religion that we're seeing. But one of them has to do with the fact that most people now participate in some form of 24/7 on-demand economy. It's less likely that that working class people at lower economic levels have their weekends off. So it might be just unaffiliation through lack of opportunity, right, to participate in religious communities. So that education is now related to that income thing, distributing all along the spectrum, where non-religion or religious unaffiliation is becoming more associated with people at lower economic levels than at higher levels. And we've long seen non-religion as a more politically progressive phenomenon. That's continuing. But let's look at how this has shifted over time. Again, a little bit of an eye chart, right? So we're looking at 2007 and 2024, and what you see is that growth from 60% male to 50% male, from 41% women to 47% women. So the big growth in non-religion is among women, and overall the growth of religious affiliation is among men, particularly white men. That's important, right? In terms of race and ethnicity, still largely a white phenomenon, but growing in every racial category. So some growth there, pretty even regional distribution still on this. Income level, again, we're seeing more distribution on income between those time periods, distribution on education, but boy and howdy, the politics of non-religion has made itself really clear, right? Increasingly, the non-religious identify as Democrats or progressives of some flavor. Right, 70%, and that seems to be growing. There's a strong correlation between being a woman, being non-white, being a Democrat, and being non-religious. That's a very different profile than I would have told you when I was writing Choosing Our Religion, right? So that's what the picture looks like now. When people are looking at this data, right, they're thinking about people in aggregate, but we need to think about, like, who is the stereotypical or the prototypical non-religious person now and emerging, right? Well, she's less likely to be white. She's less likely to have a college education. She's less likely to make over $100,000 a year. And she's less likely to live on the coasts, and she's a she, right? So that's important in this overall story. Generational differences are also important, right? So again, that the chart that I showed earlier marks a 2-year 1% downtick in unaffiliation, a 2-year 1% uptick in religious affiliation. So when you look at from 1990, I'm going to show this trend in a minute, but this is just like a math thing. When you look at the trend from 1990, when we see the big increase in religious unaffiliation, to 2024, that's a kind of nothing, right? In data terms, right? And generationally, we're seeing patterns that make clear that what comes next doesn't seem like it's going to sustain that, right, as a trend. So when we look at 2007, 2014, 2023, and 2024 at different generations, it's really clear what the trend is. For people who are my students now, who are 18 to 24 years old, right? 42% are likely to be religiously unaffiliated. Some surveys take that over 50%. In some, on the West Coast, for example, in California, that number is over 60%. Right? So again, when I was first teaching that non-religion class, people were kind of crawling out of corners to find their way to that class. Now, in all of my classes, regardless of, I taught a course on the Christian tradition this quarter for a colleague who was on leave. And when I surveyed the students at the beginning of the quarter, 45% said they were religiously unaffiliated or disidentified. So while generationally, we might be seeing upticks among younger people, and we see this little dip down here in 20 to 30 somethings, it's still an overall trend increase, right? Over time, what we see is that about 12% of people who would be marked as baby boomers, those born before 1960, roughly, identify as unaffiliated. That almost doubles to 20% among my people, Gen Xers that everybody ignores, so you can just pass over that. 30% among millennials, and 40+% among younger people. So that little blip, interesting. Is it a trend? Again, probably not. And again, that data point about who the prototypical non-religious person is in America right now is super important in this. Couple other things to think about. In terms of religious stickiness, so what we know about religion is that people, most people do not come to be a particular kind of religious, have a particular kind of religious identity because of some deeply held belief. In fact, belief is one of the weakest indicators of religiosity. It's because they were raised in that family, right? There's no infant that says, please baptize me, mommy, daddy, right? So religious stickiness comes from family relationships, largely from social engagement. It's really important to think about religion and non-religion not as ideological phenomena, but as social phenomena. Right? So kids who were raised Christian, who are now in their 30s, right? About 30% of them become religiously unaffiliated. In their 40s, it was 18%, right? Muslims, a little stickier, right? Again, when we think about religion as a social rather than ideological phenomenon, you can imagine why Muslims in America might stick with a community that shares cultural, historical, some political, and other characteristics in common in the United States, right? For those raised unaffiliated, Wow, right? 73% of the children of unaffiliated people remain unaffiliated as adults. Among 30-year-olds, among 40-year-olds, close to 60%. Right? So there's very low levels of loss in unaffiliation. What that means is when we look at those young adults, my students who are identifying as non-religious, as they get older and if they decide to have families, they are likely to pass on unaffiliation to their children. Right? So it's really sticky. Yes.
Can you please tell us what the question was that the person answered so that we know what they said to her affiliation?
Yeah, so the question is about what's the
What was the
question to get to these numbers?
Yes.
Yeah, people were asked, how were you raised? And what is your religious affiliation now? So for people who were answered, I was raised as a Christian.
So it's multiple choice. How were you raised? Christian?
Yes, right. And then another question. So this is correlational data, right? So people who are raised as a Christian who are in their 30s, right? 66% of them say, I'm still a Christian. 31 of them say, I'm not religious at all. And 3% that say that there's some other religion, right? Among the unaffiliated people who answered the question, how were you raised? They said, I was raised without religion. 73% of 30-year-olds in that cohort said they remain non-religious. 5% became some other religion, 21% Christian, right? So if you're a Christian shopping for new Christians, the marketplace is here.
Yeah.
It's not over there, and the market's not good there either.
Can you say, tell people if I hand up, then we'll pass the mic. Not like the people on the outside can't hear. Okay?
Alrighty.
For everybody.
Okay, so yeah, if you just put your hand up and then Alex will get you the mic, that'd be great. Okay, so all this deeper profiling of the non-religious allows us to see a trend line that bypasses that 2-year 1% blip, right? That says even when we take the data about people who are coming into the country, who are bringing religious diversity in with them, maybe other religious groups, right? Even when we factor that in, what we see is that by 2050, this is going to be a majority non-religious country. That's most likely. And this is looking at Pew General Social Survey and PRI and American Family Values Survey data combined. So there are some scenarios that can change this, some things that are going to impact this. And that's not unrelated to that political and gender stacking that we saw. So I say this all by way of saying it's really hard to measure religiosity and non-religion because it's not just a yes/no question on a survey, and because we're dealing with human beings, right? So one of the things that most surveys ask is for professed religious identity, right? Who do you say that you are when somebody says, what's your religion, right? And I'm going to guess you all know lots of people who say, well, I'm Catholic. Well, where do you go to church? Oh, I don't go. I haven't gone since I was in high school, right? So professed identity doesn't really tell us necessarily a whole lot about religious practice. Where do you belong? This is a really complicated question, right? You say that you're an Episcopalian. Maybe you even belong to the local Episcopal church. Just today in the New York Times, there was an article about the Catholic Church's involvement in immigration. And one of the bishops quoted in that article said, it's really hard for us to address these social justice issues because our data says that maybe 20% of people who identify as Catholic actually attend church more than once a month, right? So you say you belong to it, but do you? Practice, this gets tricky. So reported practice. So Tom, how often do you go to services? And, I'm maybe a little intimidating because I'm a scholar. Tom doesn't want to seem like a wayward heathen. And so he says, well, every couple weeks, right? What we know about reported practice as compared to measured practices, religions are really good at counting people. Y'all are really probably counted people here today, right? There are reasons for that, lots of complex reasons for that, most of it having to do with funding, right? Is that people report their religious practice at higher levels than it's actually measured in institutional religious services. So when scholars go to a Catholic diocese or a Buddhist temple or whatever and say how many people come here a week, they know, and it doesn't match, often by a lot. There's about a 7 to 12% difference in that. And then professed beliefs. What do you believe about God or salvation or whatever, have almost no bearing on religious identification and affiliation. So one of the things I talked about in Choosing Our Religion, a lot of the focus of that was on people who identified as nuns, as having no religion, but who were doing things that looked pretty religious to me. Praying, doing rituals, all those kinds of things, and claiming certain kinds of beliefs. So we'll talk more about that, but that's what makes that little blip in the whole scene kind of hard to track, right? So what we see in data from Gallup reported last year for the first time since they've been tracking that fewer than half of the people in the United States who identify as religious attend services on a regular basis, which they marked as once a month, so 12 times a year. So that line at 50%, right? Muslims, a little bit better at it. Mormons going a lot, but still 30%, right? Protestants, 40% showing up, all the way down. And of course, nuns, there's 10% of nuns who are going because their grandma's going there, I think, or something like that, and they want to hang out with them, right? So what we see is that regardless of how they identify, many religious people don't actually practice religion, at least not in the conventional ways that we have seen. And there's considerable fluidity of belief. So earlier this year, Arizona Christian University did a survey that was developed by this guy, George Barna, who's a social scientist, studies. He's a very conservative evangelical, but a social scientist who I think my sense is he feels like if they can just get the right data, they can intervene at the place where belief collapses, very belief focused. So for years, he's been looking at this data. He's a really good researcher in this way. And you should read this and it's a hair on fire thing if you're an evangelical Christian, right? Because when they asked, do you believe there is only one supreme spiritual being? He created the rules and everything in existence. Among all Americans, more than half said, no, not really, right? And, they're able to say, well, yeah, but that includes y'all heathens. So, okay. But when we looked at self-identified Christians, 40% of self-identified Christians say, no, I don't actually believe that, right? And then among self-identified born-again Christians, which is Barna's focus and Arizona Christian University's focus, a quarter of them are like, no, I don't actually believe that, right? Which raises the question, people of other religions, no, really. And the unaffiliated, pretty much no, right? Raises the question, what are these people doing in these religious communities? Like, what are they getting from this identification, right? And it continues, right? Do you believe a spiritual deity or higher power may exist, but nobody really knows for certain? Essentially, they're measuring agnosticism, right? So among the American population as a whole, 80% agnostic in terms of belief, right? Self-identified Christian, almost 85%. And again, born again, 93%. 93%. I'm sorry, 7%, rather flipping it the other way. 93% are saying, no, I don't, so there's pervasive doubt, even among Christians. I just read that data backwards, apologize. But there's a weaker commitment to doctrine than people generally think. So why is that? Right? Why is all of this? For a long time, people have been positing why there have been increases in non-religion, right? Science, evolution, all of those kinds of things, right? Make religion seem irrational, right? Well, yeah, except for this. We do irrational things all the time. We are not highly rational beings, right? We drink alcohol, some people smoke cigarettes or weed, we eat fatty foods. We know it's wrong. We do it because it feels good to do it. Or maybe we have some deep-seated psychological issue, I don't know, whatever. But we do lots of irrational things, right? But that could be something. We have, forever, right? People lived short, violent, difficult lives, right? Until the 1900s, 50%, fully 50% of pregnancies ended with the death of the mother, the child, or both, until 1900, right? So that's going to gin up belief in something else, right? We don't have those issues so much in developed Western countries, so maybe not so much a thing, right? Of course, we've had all these religious scandals that people are very aware of, right? Social issues, religious pluralism, big thing, right? Since 1965, right? When the Immigration Act removes quotas, and people are allowed to, right? LBJ in the middle of the night says, this is not going to make any difference. I'll sign this thing. People from India will never come here. People from Asia will never want to come here, right? So we're seeing these influxes of religion. Once you've seen them, right? In the very small town in Pennsylvania that I grew up in, Zelienople, population 4,000, if everyone was home, right? Pluralism was the Catholics live down here, the Lutherans live there, and the Presbyterians live there, right? In a very small town, that's it. No one ever thought to think about a Buddhist or a Hindu or anything like that, right? And then of course, all of this is amplified by access to information through the internet and social media. That's certainly true. But when we think about religion and non-religion as social phenomena, we also need to think of how they're participating in overall social and cultural systems. And one of the key drivers of the development of the uniqueness of religion in the United States is that the United States, the colonial America in the United States, develops exactly hand in glove with the development of market capitalism. There is a reason that American Protestantism became known as the religion that multiplies by dividing, right? And that, Moody Bible Institute starts in Chicago in the late 1800s in order to use market mechanisms to promote the gospel. They're closely tied, right? And we start to see neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism as a grounding social phenomenon that amplifies all of these other things, right? So what do we mean by this? Neoliberal capitalism, neoliberalism is about making everything a part of the market economy, right? The market essentially functions like a god, right? We have Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? It's mysterious, it's omnipotent, right? Harvey Cox, talks about this kind of market, these market features taking over all of the functions. There are rituals associated with them, and all of these kinds of things. All of the functions of a kind of transcendent creator that's out there making things work, right? When that happens, we become increasingly atomized, separated from each other, and developing our own approaches to life, which feels very democratic. We're fans of that, right? You do you. But it also leads to, what theologians would refer to as quietism, the idea that I can take care of myself, and I don't have to worry about other people, because it'll all, right? We got the invisible hand. It'll all sort itself out, right? Religions become more entrepreneurial. Again, the Moody Institute starts this. We have to start using marketing. We have to start using better websites, better social media, all of these kinds of things. And religion and politics become increasingly blurred. And again, when we go back to that very early data, or the early slide that I showed that shows women and being a woman, being a Democrat, being middle class or below as an increasing driver of non-religion, whereas that 1% blip is mostly educated, affluent white men who are Republicans. We see where the shift is playing out, right? And so what this results in is a whole wave of different forms of religion and non-religion. And choosing our religion, I referred to the counterpoint to nuns as somes, to people who still have some religion. I made the argument in that book, which was accurate for the time, but I wouldn't say that it is for now, that religions were really the factories for the non-religious. They were doing the things that were pushing people away from religion. When I talk to my students now, again, we've got a generation under our belts of the non-religious. They were often raised in non-religious families, so they're there for stickiness. They're not rejecting anything, right? So we still have some people who are religious. They have some religion. Remember, their beliefs aren't really necessarily what is doctrinally defined in their communities, right? But they do tend to have what's referred to as strong religion. They're closely identified with it in important ways, or at least kind of hard moderate. There's still progressive religion, but it's the most rapidly declining area of religious affiliation. So United Church of Christ, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, dropping like flies, right? Which sounded meaner than I wanted it to be. I was raised as an Episcopalian, but so that. And then we have all kinds of religious nuns. right? The easy ones, the atheists and the agnostics, which people routinely confuse, but the kind of no God people, probably no God people, very small percentage. The most generous demographics on atheists and agnostics is about 7%. That's about double since 1990. Right? There are a whole group of people that get classified by Pew and other demographers as nothing in particular, but they are actually not nothing in particular. People who are in the ethical culture movement or humanists, right? Who they look at the thing and they go, nothing on this list. Neo-pagans, Wiccans, other folks who just don't fit into those frameworks. So we don't count those very well. And then there are people who would identify as nothing in particular, but have lots of variation, right? Somebody who identifies as secular is very different than somebody who says they're spiritual but not religious, right? And we have difficulty measuring that. Then there's this other category that's a growing category that was developed by a sociologist named Josh Packard of religious duns. And those are people who Packard argues still maintain belief sets associated with their religions, but they're largely alienated from the institutional forms of religion. So they're done with that. They're either disaffected entirely or they're apathetic toward religion. They're indifferent or apathetic toward it. So we get this whole variety of it. And the way this relates to being part of a neoliberal social system is that it means that there are lots of choices that people can move through in their lives, and that religious or non-religious identification becomes a part of personal branding meant to distinguish people from each other that tends to undermine the very kinds of communities that you're developing here, right? So it becomes less about belonging, less about connecting with people and acting together, and more about, I'm going to be me, right? I'm going to do this. And that might change throughout a lifetime, right? And so we see practices that are about personal customization, right? I'm going to do this now, a kind of practical cosmopolitanism, right? Where we have to be able to interact with other people and accept that we're in relationship with them. But we don't have what the philosopher Ulrich Beck would call institutionalized cosmopolitanism, where we actually have social infrastructure that allows people to come together in this way, right? One of the things that has allowed religious institutions to endure is that even in the United States, they're largely state-sponsored. Right? I live in Willow Glen. I was just on the driving around the corner the other day. I looked, big sign in front of the local elementary school in the concrete. So in a post, like a stop sign would go into, in the concrete, for the Methodist church down the street. And I thought, how did the Methodist church get a 18 by 18 inch 18-inch square sign at the main drag of Willow Glen saying the Methodist church? There's like 20 churches down that street on Minnesota. Why that one? Well, that church has been in that community for a very long time. It's got people who are involved in the business community, yada, 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 knows how to make that work, right? So that most of the Episcopal and Anglican and congregational churches on the East Coast of the United States own property because of royal land grants, right? Wealthiest church in the United States, Trinity Wall Street, was given Manhattan by the king, right? Still owns a lot of it. So in terms of infrastructure, institutional religions have had that in a way that non-religion, despite the best efforts of Felix Adler, ever had. Right? We got one building in New York. So what that means is that religions have been able to do a good job of, functioning philosophically and theologically in people's lives. They've provided lots of psychological support and lots of social support, right? They've been sites, as Emil Durkheim would say, of social cohesion. They've helped people to develop social identity. They have allowed people to do social organizing. When we think of the civil rights movement, a lot of that's centered around churches, continuing to do advocacy, all these kinds of things. And I'm not suggesting that non-religious organizations don't do that, but I promise you, and I'm guessing Judy would attest to that, when my students come to my class, they have no idea that there are non-religious organizations, and they do not know where to find them, right? There's not a big sign saying the Humanist Community of Silicon Valley is down the street there in the big building on the land that they were given by the town of Willow Glen in 18 whatever. Right, that didn't happen. So that raises some critical questions as we look toward this future when we're going to be a majority non-religious nation for organizations like yours, I think, right? First is, for a long time, non-religion was seen as simply the absence of religion, just the evacuation of religion. This, it's called the subtraction theory. It's just gone. Increasingly, scholars, myself, Lois Lee, others, have looked at non-religion as another way of doing those social functions that has not enjoyed the social, cultural, political support that religions have had to develop the kind of infrastructure to allow it to meet those social needs. So can non-religious communities begin to articulate a communitarian worldview and practice that challenges neoliberal atomization and quietism? And I know that lots of groups are doing that in lots of ways, right? Can non-religion fill the social gaps that will develop as religion declines, right? 10 years ago, even earlier, when I was doing work on choosing our religion, non-religious communities were just super excited, right, that there was a shift happening, and that so many people were identifying as non-religious. You'll remember, like that was when Sunday assembly was in its ascendancy, right? That has kind of petered out, right, all around the world. So we have to think about what the challenge is to non-religious communities in light of this, right? Yes, that downturn in religious unaffiliation is probably a blip, but it's a blip with political heft, because religious identification is now so closely associated with gender and politics that it's going to continue to have a certain kind of power. And so I guess I just come here to challenge you. This is what I challenge my students to do, is to think about what future generations of non-religious people look like. What do they need in terms of social infrastructure? How can that be developed and sustained beyond this group, right? And how can that begin to act in the world? If religion is going away, a lot of the social functions that religion has legitimately performed are also going with that. So we have to think about how to mind the gap. And so that's what I got.
Judy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was terrific. I've been wondering about all these questions and you just answered them all. That's great.
Oh, I did not.
Yeah, well, okay, you got a good start. When I look at European countries, which have 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 500 years of the Catholic Church,
Take a second and push this button here.
no wonder, start over.
Yeah.
When I look at European countries, which have 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 500 years, 300 years of the religion being favored by the government, and it's still even happening today, actually being favored financially by the government in most European countries. And yet, most Europeans are now non-religious, are now secular. Okay, are the European countries a model for where the United States is headed or not? If so, why? If not, why not?
I mean, it's a complicated question because of the diverse histories, but non-religion and secularism in Europe is different than it is in the United States, in that it comes out largely out of the French Revolution and philosophical movements around that. And so it's about the structuring of government as it was embedded in religions. In the United States, that was, of course, a background to the colonial project and the revolution, right, that started, but it wasn't embedded from the beginning in exactly the same way as it was in Europe. So that, it's just a different process here. Europe didn't have, because of that 3,000 or more, 5,000, 20,000 year relationship with forms of organized religion. It was not a market developed religiosity, right? When we think about, what everybody learns in the United States in kindergarten, right, about why the Pilgrims came to America. Yeah, they didn't, right? They did not, right? So very quickly, when the English Puritans who first came on ye old Mayflower, right? Where did they come from? They came from Holland, right? They had been persecuted as Puritans, and they left. They went to Holland, and they had the experience that many immigrants had. They had been merchants in the wool industry. They got to Holland, which was much more religiously liberal. They liked that, but they didn't like that they got crappy jobs and poor housing, and that their kids were being influenced by those, Dutch heathens all around them. And they decided after 20 years, not a week later, after 20 years, about 100 of them, kind of, sort of, that gets complex because some of them were separatists and some of them were non-separatists. They literally put a towel down the middle, or a sheet down the middle of the Mayflower, so they have to talk to each other, right? They came to America. And why did they come to the American colonies? They had religious freedom. They wanted some money. They were here to make money. They sold lottery tickets to pay for their journey, right? They owed money on that. When the second batch of Puritans come, right, and we get the famous city on a hill speech, right? That's not about being a moral, a moral model to the world. That's about those pilgrims who were from the elite classes, who got first stock traded company in the world, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? They get first publicly traded company in the world. They get to come, and they think they're gonna do it right, right? Nothing's happened to them. They haven't been persecuted. They're just out of favor, and they think it could go badly. So they prevail on the king to give them land in the colonies to make the money. And that whole shining city on a hill speech is about, I'm sorry, I could wound up about this, right, is about, we got to make money, because if we do, then England will see our light. They'll realize our mistake, and they'll take us back, right? It's like your friend who breaks up with somebody and says, I'm going to go to the gym and then they'll want me so much. And you're like, oh God, right? It was like that. So those were money-making projects, very different than what happens in Europe, right? The diversification in religion in the United States and the American colonies in the United States is very much about, we got to have people to extract these resources from this country. And so we felt very strongly about your Puritanism in England, but for now, keep killing beavers.
Okay, Tom?
Oh, sorry.
Press which button?
Oh, it's on.
Okay. Well, I think that today it seems like people are finding community and connection, which is really lacking in modern society with all the technology that's going on, social media and so forth, and virtual reality. And they're going to protests, and they're going to like Black Lives Matter,
Yes.
especially. The recent protests, the demographics are somewhat older, but also to concerts.
Mhm.
And so if the humanists and the atheists are interested in reaching out, I think they have to think along these lines somewhat. If people have a common purpose that unites them together, like a protest, like the
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter and the underclass. And then women, another point I wanted to make is I think one reason why women are more turned off toward religion these days than men is because women tend to be more family, they're more nurturing, and they have more compassion. And so when they see the discrimination that is kind of built into some religions and how the political right is acting, then the women are more likely to move away from that. There were fewer women that supported Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I know plenty of nurturing and compassionate men. I think that women experience discrimination in different ways, and men get power from religion. So when you think about function, right, you see, it's very clear. I teach lots of religious classes too, right? I send students to churches, temples, whatever, and I always ask them to look at who's doing what, right? Who's standing up and being listened to, who's serving cookies, right? Who's taking care of children, right? They get it very quickly, right? What the functions of religion are. It gives men power and authority, not always, but often, traditionally. It gives women can have subversive power in those contexts, but it's through that kind of belief in women being nurturing, and so you can clean the altar and you can whatever, and women get that. Like, I'm not going to be able to be fully myself here. So I think that's one aspect of it. But the thing about implicit forms of religion, those social functions that happen in protests and justice movements, in concerts, like all those are super important, right? Evangelicals got the concert thing, right? They got, Durkheim talks about collective effervescence, this idea that we all do something together and it creates a feeling of bondedness. The way that you went to, I don't know, Coachella, and you went to, and we were like, oh my gosh, you went too, right? Did you see Beyonce? Right? And we feel an immediate connection, and it brings those feelings back. Religions do that, right? And so for non-religious groups to take part in that is to connect in that way, but it's not just that, right? It's also that and the social justice work, that and having infrastructure. I just can't say enough about that. And I have no idea. This is why I said to Judy, I don't have the answers. I have no idea how to make this happen, but it has to do with, in the United States, having built infrastructure matters.
Les, you had your hand up?
So is there a correlation with people with small children and becoming religious perhaps to get a moral structure. And people have this idea that they don't understand the example of Scandinavia where, there's very little crime, violent crime, and yet they think that atheists don't have morals built in.
Yeah, no, actually, there's no correlation. So what we're seeing increasingly, there used to be a thing, so in the 1960s, when the early kind of spiritual but not religious movement develops out of the AA movement, right, and woo-woo spiritualities develop, there's a sense that, that happens. People reject religion when they're in college or maybe when they're in high school, but when they get married, they'll want to get married in church and they'll want to raise their kids to have that moral foundation. That is increasingly not happening. And again, that's because we're now a generation or two into the rise of the nuns. And so we have parents who themselves were raised in non-religious households. Maybe they went to church with grandma a few times. And why do we go to church with grandma? Because we love her, not because Jesus, right? One of the hair on fire things in that George Barna report is that he sees that 35% of the born again Christians that he survey don't believe exclusively in Jesus. And you can just see him losing his mind in this report, like that they don't. And he's asking, like, well, why do they go to church at all? Because we like grandma, right? It's not Jesus, we like singing, right? Things like that. So it's not happening in the way that we would have seen in the 60s or 70s. So with boomers, that they kind of came back and then did some shopping for the right religion and maybe move to a more progressive religion or a more conservative religion, depending on where they, whatever, to raise their kids, and then you go do yours. But after you've gone through that cycle, it actually doesn't lather, rinse, repeat. You're like, no, I'm good.
You had your hand up?
No.
Oh, sorry. Zen,
Oh.
you had your hand.
I did. Thank you, Professor Drescher, as always, for an intriguing talk. I have a statistical question. You had a few slides back, you had this stacked bar graph that broke down the nuns by gender, income, region of the country, education level, and so forth. But what I'm interested in is how under or overrepresented the nuns are in the different groups. In other words, if you had similar distribution just showing the population, what percentage of the population lives in the South or the West, uh, uh, versus what percentage of the population in the South considers themselves nuns. So we can get a sense of over or under representation statistically.
Yeah, I don't have that data. It's a great question. It is a great, the way the data is presented generally assumes an even distribution, right? In all geographic areas or in all class groups or in all education groups. That Pew does have some of that data, PRRI doesn't. I haven't looked at the General Social Survey, but it would be a good way to look at it.
No,
For sure.
I meant like population, census data. How many people
Yeah,
live in the
you
South,
could,
right?
yeah, you could do that. You could pull General Social Survey data, which pulls on census units, look at how people identify religiously and see how that's mapped around the country. I just haven't done that.
Okay, Paul.
I liked one of my grandmothers. She liked me. But my question is, maybe it's peripheral, but you cited some figures at some particular period, maybe around 1900, at that period, that half of the expectant mothers or the child died,
Mhm.
or both.
Or both.
And that was around 1900.
Was until the early 20th century, that was pretty much how pregnancy went.
That's by age 5. That's not at
It,
birth.
yeah,
That's important.
yeah. You're right. The point I was making is that people led difficult, brutal lives and were likely to die early. Like if we were standing here in 1800, half of us wouldn't be standing here. right, or sitting here, right?
Okay.
People died early, you know.
So that wasn't specifically due to pregnancy or
Go ahead, Judy, yeah.
Okay.
Could I
You-
answer that? What Dr. Drescher was saying is that the data showed in 1900 that essentially babies, children who were born alive, not dead, born alive, by age 5, approximately half of them were already dead. And of course, a lot of women died in childbirth, during pregnancy, during childbirth, in the postpartum period, and so forth. So there was an enormous proportion of children who never made it past age 5 and certainly never made it to adulthood. Now that's totally different, of course.
Chris, you had your hand up?
Yeah, and I just would add the point that I was making there is that when you lead a short, difficult life and you're likely to die from terrible things, it's a lot easier to believe in a supernatural being or force that might either intervene in that or make it better for you after, right? What I often say to religious organizations is if they want to increase religion, do a better job at selling hell, right? That's what worked for the Great Awakenings, right? Exactly. That is exactly true. Yeah. Fear, hell, damnation, all of those kinds of things, very powerful.
Okay. Great presentation. I'm here.
Oh.
Yeah. Hi. This may be a semantic distinction, but I make a distinction between religion and theism, which I think many in this room do not.
Mhm.
And on the rare occasion that I'm pressed on what my beliefs are, I say I'm a religious non-theist,
Right.
and wait for people to call me out on the apparent oxymoron. And I'm a member of both of the groups within the United States that I'm aware of that would fit that label, Unitarian Universalists and ethical culture.
Mhm.
You know, the fact that you can have a belief system and a set of moral values that doesn't depend on belief in the supernatural.
Mhm.
And that, at least on the surface, would seem to fit the bill. You know, these would seem to be groups that should attract all these nuns, and yet, you know, at last check, I think ethical culture had fewer than 2,000 members countrywide. And, you know, UU is much bigger, but still pretty small and to some extent struggling. So, you know, they provide community, you know, all these things which we talk about as being an attraction to religion. And yet, you know, they don't seem to be successful. So if you have any perspective on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I just, like I'm in awe of Felix Adler. I could, you know, like his way of understanding the functional work done by religion and the need for that in society was so powerful, right? And it's really looking at, and every time I send students to ethical culture, someone gives them a little mini lecture about what's not religion, you know, and then they have to kind of wrestle with that, right? Buddhism is a non-theistic religion, right? As well, right? This is what drove me into neoliberal capitalism, is when you look at, and I was led there by two scholars named Jeremy Carrette and Richard King, who wrote a book years ago called The Selling of Spirituality, the Silent Takeover of Religion, which is about the way in which neoliberal capitalism has atomized our religiosity so much so that the appeal of collective religious practice, whatever it is, or collective practice in general, has been undermined, right? Because what the corporate person needs is for us to not organize, is for us to not act together, is for us to not feel like we share common cause, right? And so when that becomes a big part of the culture, the defining element in the culture, as I think it is in late stage capitalism, then things that might, ideologically draw people into a community simply will not. And that's why, students are always surprised when they, go to visit with the Atheists in San Pedro Square, which they love so much, I can't even begin to tell you. But they're always surprised that it's, people who, the olds, as we refer to them, right? That it's, people over 50 generously, right? And, and so on. And it's because culturally, for boomers a little bit into Gen X, right? We were not socialized so much in neoliberal capitalist systems of consumer choice that define identity and personal practice. And so I know it can sound like, I did a version of this talk at Loma Linda University a few months, and let me just tell you, this went over like a lead balloon, right? When, right, when, it can feel like a political rant, and in my heart it is, but as a social scientist, it's really like, this is just the structure of society. This is how it functions in the United States, and it is going to undermine both religion and non-religion. And all of those functions are going to be privatized into feudalism, quite frankly. Yeah.
I see Jim's had his hand up for a while. And then I'll get you.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, thank you. So we've seen the Supreme Court most recently allowing parents to withdraw their students when LGBTQ issues are discussed in school. And the court is likely to continue to expand what's called religious rights. And also, the Trump administration, one of the major supporters group is religious nationalist, Christian nationalist. And we see a lot of religious language in the administration, as well as religious symbolism. So I'm wondering if any of these things you think will affect the trends which you've been discussing.
Yeah, again, when I look at the data that shows that 1% blip is mostly affluent white men, I see Christian nationalism written all over it. And that's, and there are people who've done studies with people who are involved in the MAGA movement and their religiosity, and they profess, you saw on, at the insurrection, the flags with Jesus on it, crosses, people waving on it. So they profess a robust religiosity, but they're not active participants. They're not actually showing up and doing things. So it's an identity marker. It's become a political identity marker. And in order to have power in that community, they're going to continue to use that identity marker. The question is, is there space in these policies that advantage religions for non-religion to be doing that? What was Adler's and John Dewey's move? Like education, right? So if you're going to be funding charter schools, great, get me one of those, right? How do we begin to use the mechanisms of government to create other forms of infrastructure? I'm all with the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house in its entirety, but it might get you out the door.
Tom.
Well, I think one big elephant in the room that's responsible for young males that are turning toward the Republican Party and are supporting Trump, especially white young males, but also blacks as well, needs to be addressed. And I have some Republican friends. I have one friend of mine who's an atheist, but is also a MAGA supporter and a male. And some of the factors that enter into this are that the more secular organizations like the ethical culture and the humanists and the atheists are not only populated in general by Democrats, but the general, from my experience, going to ethical culture and both these other groups, is that they lean much farther to the left in general than the general population of Democrats do. And the people that are moving, the young people going toward Trump and going toward religion, since there's this close association with Trump, Republican Party, and Christianity, is that the young males, and this is something that Jonathan Haidt has mentioned, McWhorter has mentioned, Bill Maher especially has mentioned, is that male toxicity is sometimes an overcorrection to something that very really has a real true foundation to it. And so the males feel, young males are looking for an identity, and they see Trump as a masculine figure who's not ashamed of being white, not ashamed of being male. And so I think that factors into it, and that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big challenge. Like, how does, you know, how do you create a movement that includes everybody, right? I mean, when you look at kind of the Joe Roganization of politics in general, right? That's a largely secular group. Like, those people aren't crazy religious.
Yeah.
They're just crazy. Right? And they want to associate themselves with something that feels powerful. And here's the truth. White dudes in America are more vulnerable than they were in the past. They're more vulnerable, I'm sorry. White people in general, white men in particular, are more vulnerable in a genuine meritocracy, right? When you set up policies, like when my dad came back from World War II, he, marched himself to college and marched himself into a job, and nobody asked him. There were no people who didn't look like me standing in that line, minus ovaries, right? So it's harder for white dudes now. It doesn't happen in exactly that way, and so that feels threatening and uncomfortable. And when there's an identity movement that uses the power of the government and the power of some kind of supernatural force and being to reinforce maleness and whiteness, that's intoxicating and powerful.
We're getting low on time. I've got three more people with their hands up, so we'll try to get through this quickly. Jim, you're next.
I wonder if you'd have any comment on the devotion to religion and the fervent devotion to sports teams, especially those in Europe where these soccer enthusiasts actually riot against each other.
Yeah. There's a phenomenon that's called implicit religion, right? That looks at the way in which sports teams, celebrities, influencers, and other large social phenomena mimic the functions that have been traditionally associated with religions. So it's happening in the same way, right? We know that historically, right, the development of human societies beyond the family and clan level was facilitated by activities like, if we go back to Göbekli Tepe, thousands and thousands of years ago in Turkey, right? The way people gathered after the hunt and they started doing ritual practices that came to look like religion, right? And that facilitated the growth of cities, for one thing, but also kinds of tribalism that were competitive, right? That continues. Religions still do that function. And so when institutional religion or institutional non-religion isn't able to function in that way for a variety of reasons, that's still a social need, right? There's still a need to identify with a group, to feel protected by a group, to feel part of something, to feel like you have some kind of moral norming around the way we talk about our team, the way we talk about the other team, whatever, right? That's going to happen. It's going to pop up in other parts of the culture. And so when I look at the non-religious movement in the United States in the last 50 years, so much energy on protecting separation of church and state. Yay, I'm a fan. Keep doing that. So much energy around a number of legal issues and educational issues. Yay, keep doing that. Less cohesion in social and communitarian ways than we've seen. And again, lots because not sponsored by the government. So that.
Okay, two more questions.
Yeah.
Bob?
Now, I think that the count of atheists is vastly undercounted, because when somebody's asked and you say, I'm an atheist, you're taking a risk of some extent, especially in a business environment. It's much safer to say, well, I was baptized Catholic,
right,
and let it go at that. So do you think that's true, that it's vastly undercounted?
For sure, for absolute sure, in a number of ways. One is, even though, thanks to the new atheists, whatever else we might say about them, atheism is a more known phenomenon in the last 20 years than it was. People still don't know specifically what it means. When I quiz my students at the beginning of the quarter, they don't know what an atheist is as opposed to an agnostic, what it means to be secular. So there's just part of that. There's a variety of labels. Which one am I? And then there's, in part thanks to the new atheists, the idea that these are mean people who just yell at each other, right, and want to hurt religious people or whatever, right? So, and that they're immoral, right? So there's that. And so people feel like, I've had students say to me, like, look, I'm probably an atheist, right? If that were a label, that would be 90% of my non-religious students would be probably atheist, but I got to go home for Thanksgiving, like I don't want to deal with Uncle Frank. So yes, people don't report well. Religious people don't report well either. And so that's why in my research, I focus on practice. What do you do? What is it that you do? I don't actually care very much about what you believe. I don't care very much about who you say you are. I care what you do.
Okay, Zem, you get the last word, or the last question anyway.
Perhaps I should unmute. Yeah, both Tom and Jim raised excellent points. We could spend like hours talking about it, but I have a question about neoliberalism itself. You spoke of the atomization of society, but people like Timothy Garton Ash argue that neoliberalism itself is in crisis. And by that, they mean economic crisis, that, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've been on this sort of capitalist kick, which resulted in income inequality and stagnation for many people in their lives. And, when there is hardship, people turn to God or some sort of a communitarian solution. He actually wasn't talking about religion. He was talking about things like Brexit or the election of Donald Trump, right? Things that normally would not have happened. So what is your view on this sort of the declining economic?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely, like there's a reason, political economists call this late stage capitalism. Like, it's declining. We've milked the planet almost to extinction. People get that. And we have greater income inequality, all of those kinds of things. And we see with like part of that blip, which again tracks religiosity to political identification, can have to do with people feeling like if I'm not a white American, if I identify in this way, I get the benefits of whiteness, right? So a lot of the Latino vote or the Asian vote toward MAGAism might be associated with that, and a lot of professed religiosity might be associated with that. So I agree that neoliberalism is declining, but it's still the underlying structure. It's not a healthy structure, but it's still the structure that's been in place for the last 50 years. And so it's shaped our cultural norms.